Last night, wow, boy, there we go. I can hear myself now. Last night at the college, we had a Valentine's concert, and I noticed Pastor's wife was there, but Pastor was not. And I told her, I said, you tell him, don't give me this stuff that he had to stay at home to prepare his message on Sunday, because I'm preaching for him all day on Sunday. So, no, you would rub it in. You would rub it in. And but it was good to see her last night, and it just caused us again to remember the opportunity that we would have to minister to you this week. And so in the Sunday School Hour, I'd like to give us something from a portion of Scripture that I really think is an essential for God to do a great work in our hearts this week. I'm not sure what you think about this meeting or how you're approaching it. That's always an important thing. Sometimes people are like, we have busy lives, and this is just going to really stretch our evenings. That's one way to look at it, but I'm going to tell you, if that's the way you look at it, you're not going to get out of it what the Lord wants you to have. I'm sure all of us have busy lives. But the most important thing, and Dr. Curalo taught me this years ago when I was a freshman in Bible college, is the fact that God has spoken. The most important person in the universe has spoken to us. And each day, each service, He wants us to listen. And so I hope that as you start this week, please don't start it with, it's just going to be a busy week. No, let's just have a spirit of anticipation in every service, just like you would anticipate a steak. Brother Curalo talks about eating prime rib. And anticipate that God's going to work in our hearts through His Word. It's a great way to approach a meeting. And I trust in the Sunday School Hour that as we learn about a very important subject, that God will use it to prepare us for the week. I look forward to getting to know some of you more as you come through this week. We'll be here earlier in the services, be able to talk and fellowship and get some dirt on our students who come here and their meanness so we can correct them. I am delighted. I'm delighted to see our students who are here, and it's just a wonderful thing. And I know that they're in good hands. And so if they get out of line, that's okay. You tell Pastor, and he knows what to do with them, all right? James chapter 4, I want to read one verse for our text, but we'll be referring to the context a good bit in our introduction. James chapter 4 and verse number 10, the Bible says, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He shall lift you up. And I believe for God to do a work this week in our hearts, it's very important for us to have a heartbeat of humility. Through the years, I've heard a lot of sermons. I hear sermons every week at Ambassador in our chapel services on the rare occasion that I'm home. I'll hear a Sunday morning, Sunday school lesson. I'll hear Sunday morning. I'll hear Sunday night. And then I'll hear Wednesday night. That's 4 messages alone in my local church. But before you feel sorry for me, let me add on to that 4 chapel sermons on top of that. So in the course of an average week, if I happen to be at home, I might hear 8 messages in 1 week. Now, it's never made me break out into rashes or get in fevers or fits. But if my evangelistic preaching class is preaching that very same week, that's an additional 6 sermons, 2 a day, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday that I hear. So you do the math, you're talking 13 to 14 messages. It's possible for me to hear in a week. I've heard a lot of preaching through the years. But in all the preaching that I have heard, I'll tell you some of the hardest sermons I've ever come across are sermons that I've read. And not just in the pages of periodicals, but I'm talking about sermons that are read in the Bible. And few do I hear to Christians that come across with any greater passion and severity than James chapter 4. What would you think if Pastor Curalo got up next Sunday after this meeting's over with? The first words out of his mouth in the Sunday morning message, he looks at you with an accusing glance and he says these words. From whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence even of your lust that war in your members? You'd say, whoa, he is coming for blood. And he continued on, you lust and you have not, you kill and you kill and desire to have and cannot obtain. You fight and you war and you have not because you ask not. You'd say, boy, I'm not sure this is going to be an encouraging service. And then, only to become more severe, he looks at you and he says, ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. You would say at that point, this is a difficult sermon. But you know, we preachers have figured something out. You can only be hard for so long before you kill everybody. I hear some preachers, they talk about skinning the sheep. I don't like that terminology. I understand they need to be sheared, but if you skin them, they die. And under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, after giving a very difficult few verses of a message, James gives a sliver of hope. James stops for just a moment, and after telling them and denouncing them very heavily for their sinful attitudes and actions, he gives them an escape when he says, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He shall lift you up. Now, before we analyze this verse this morning, let me tell you, it's impossible to experience the greatest blessings of life apart from humility. Do you know that? You say, what do you mean? Listen, it's impossible to experience salvation without humility. You know why there are people in the Bible that said, boy, I do good things and, you know, I tithe and I do this, and there's others that say, God be merciful to me, a sinner. Do you know what makes the difference in that? Humility. And if you're here this morning and you've never humbled yourself and knelt at the cross and trusted Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, your greatest need is to humble yourself in the matter of salvation. Amen. I had to humble myself when I was 12 years old. I'd never done crystal meth. I had never robbed a bank. But I'm going to tell you something. I had to humble myself and see that I was a sinner, lost and undone. And so if you're here this morning and you've never humbled yourself in the matter of salvation, this is where it all begins for you. But I'm going to tell you, it's not just about salvation. It's impossible to experience meaningful Christian growth without salvation, or without humility. You ever met a know-it-all? Some of you are like, yeah, I'm married to one. I wouldn't say that in church. I had a roommate in college who was a know-it-all. And the dangerous thing is his explanations sounded legitimate. I could say, why is the moon gray? And he could give something that was not scientifically accurate, but it sure sounded good. But he was a know-it-all. He would hear you asking other people questions and volunteer his answers for you. And my friend, if you're here this morning and you know it all, there's a great need to humble yourself, because you'll never learn of the Lord until you humble yourself. It's impossible to experience restoration in a church apart from humility. You know what happens in churches? This may amaze you, but some people make a mess of their lives. Did you know that? Usually what happens is somebody will come to pastor and they hand him a hand grenade, and they've already pulled the pin and has a 10-second fuse, and they've held it for 9 seconds. And then they hand it to pastor and say, here, fix this. You say, no, they don't. Yes, not literally, but it's awful close sometimes. Maybe sometimes he'd wish it was a hand grenade, you know. But you can't experience restoration, Galatians 6:1, a matter of getting help, until you humble yourself and realize, you know what, I am in need. I've made some mistakes. And so I'm just going to tell you, if you're perfect, there's no need for you to come back any night this week. Because I believe really every one of us in this room, we need to hear from God and we need some help, and we've got to humble ourselves. And so I think instead of wasting our time, it would just be good in the Sunday school hour to establish in our hearts that we need to have a heartbeat of humility and humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord and claim God's promise, and He shall lift you up. Now I want to begin by first of all showing you the plea for humility that James makes when he says, humble yourselves. Now we preachers, we get accused of a lot of things. Sometimes we're falsely accused. A preacher sometimes gets up before his congregation and he pleads for help. There's always something to be done in the church. You say, well, I come to this church and I just can't find anything to do. You're just not having your eyes open or asking the right person. But sometimes we preachers, we make a plea for help. Oh, we need your talent. We need your ability. We just need your breathing body, just to please help us in some form or fashion. Sometimes a preacher can preach on money. That's a very touchy subject among Baptists. But regardless of what you may think, the Bible does talk about money, and it talks about our stewardship of it. And I've seen pastors sometimes preach one time on the subject of money. Somebody get raw after a service and they say something like this: that's all he ever talks about is money. One Sunday out of 52, and they say that's all he ever talks about is money. As if the Bible doesn't talk about it. And those same people will get hijacked or robbed by the Carolina Panthers for a $100 nosebleed seat, $20 popcorn, $50 parking, and never one time do they say, boy, that Jerry Richardson and the Panthers, all they think about is money. And they're fleecing them 16 Sundays of the year. But James is not talking about talent. James is not pleading even for money. You know what he's pleading for? Humility. Humble yourselves. You say, well, I don't have much talent. You may not. You probably have more than you think. But I'll tell you, you can humble yourself. You say, well, I'm not the best looking person in the world. You may not be, but you can humble yourself. You say, I may not have a lot of money. Why, I live in Morganton, North Carolina. It's not like this area is lifestyles of the rich and famous. But you can humble yourself. In this plea for humility, when he says, humble yourselves, I want you to understand this is a purposeful humility that is asked for here. A lot of times we think about humility and humbling, and we think about it in an accidental fashion. You say, what do you mean? Every year I preach in scores of churches. I don't keep count, but I could safely say it's many dozen. And as I preach in churches, every platform is different. There are some platforms that are logically laid out like this one. There are others that have jagged edges. There are some that have guardrails. There are others that let you openly plunge to your death. But when you're preaching in those types of settings, you have to pay attention. And let's just say in my preaching, I'm not paying attention and I slipped and I fell off the platform and I fell flat on my face. Now, you all know what you would do. Some of you are like, yes, we would look with great concern. No, you would not. Maybe a few of you that have compassion would say, well, let's don't laugh yet. Let's make sure you didn't break anything. But I'll guarantee you, when I got up and dusted off my knees, every last one of you would just laugh. And we might as well just stop the message for a little bit and get it out of our system. And then on your way out, you'd catch me and you'd say, Brother Beal, I felt sorry for you. And if I looked at you and I said, boy, I'll tell you, that really humbled me, we would understand what that means. If I said, boy, that was a humbling thing, you'd say, I bet it was. Let's say some of you ladies, you buy a new dress. The hem is a little long. You're walking out in the parking lot, your heel gets caught in the hem, and you, as all ladies do, fall gracefully to the ground. We guys, we just, bam. But ladies, somehow, some way, you manage to do it in a graceful fashion. You get up off the parking lot, you go immediately to the car, your husband gets in, and he says, "What is wrong with you?" And you say, "Oh, I just had a humbling thing happen to me. I fell down." And so when you fell down, when you got up, the first thing you did was look and see who saw you. You say, "Oh, that was a humbling thing." A lot of times we think of humility or humbling as an accidental or perchance thing. But when James says, "Humble yourselves," it's not an accident, it's on purpose. Sometimes we just need to purposefully humble ourselves. Some of you have talents and abilities that I don't have. Sometimes you just need to sit down and remember who gave them to you. Sometimes you have a will and a body in which you want to do certain things and you want to experience certain things, and those feel good, and every once in a while you need to be tapped on the back and you need to be reminded that you've been bought with a price and God wants you to serve Him. I don't think there's any greater example of purposeful humility than Philippians chapter 2. When the Bible tells us that somebody with far more ability and talent and standing than you chose to humble himself. Philippians 2:6, "Who being in the form of God thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made Himself of no reputation, and took on Him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men, and being found as fashion as a man, He humbled Himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross." I'm not trying to sound light about this, but it's not like Jesus was just leaning over the banister of heaven one day and fell down to the earth and said, "Oh, well, while I'm here, I think I'll redeem mankind." No, it didn't happen by accident. It happened on purpose. And that ought to blow our minds, because you know yourself better than anybody else on the face of the earth. You know the darkest parts of your heart. And do you know, in spite of that, Jesus still came on purpose to die for you? Jesus exemplified a purposeful humility. I ask you this morning, will you humble yourself? You know, this humility, this plea was not only purposeful, but it was also personal. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord. Now let me ask you a question. Do you think that when he says humble yourselves, that the intention of that text was for you to humble other people? Now you can argue that as long as the day is long. But I think Matthew chapter 23 really puts it in perspective when it says, "And whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that humble himself shall be exalted." I really don't think it was James' idea, "You know what, I'm going to humble Nathan Dale." By the way, have you ever wanted to humble somebody else? I ask that question to see who's truthful and who's lying in this church. You know, we preachers, we do. We see your face. We see your reaction. And for the person that's just like stone the entire time, you're either dead to the world or, there's something wrong. I remember when I was a kid, I was playing in a baseball game. I predominantly pitched, but sometimes I'd have to play out in other spots of the field. And we were in a particular game where we were getting beat like a drum. You say, "What's that? That's bad." And the coach stopped the game. He called me in from the outfield. He said, "Could you please just pitch and get us out of this game? It's been a nightmare." I said, "Gladly." And as I was warming up, and these were guys, the guys that I played against, I'd played with them all of my life. And I noticed that all my life, these guys that were warming up, they batted right-handed, but now they're saying, "We're going to get up and we're going to bat left-handed." And it was just like, this game is so far gone. I bet you we can hit with our bad side. And I'll tell you, when I saw that, it infuriated me. I wanted to humble them. You say, "How did you humble them?" With a high inside fastball as hard as I could. I didn't hit them, but I wanted to. You ever wanted to humble somebody else? Let me ask you a question. When's the last time you've humbled yourself? I'll give you this thought. Listen, you can either humble yourself or God can humble you. You say humbling yourself, that can be a painful thing. Yes, because you have to swallow your pride. But I'm going to tell you something. If God humbles you, it's more painful. You read in the Old Testament, you find a man by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was the leader of the known world of the day, had the world by the tail, so to speak. And yet with one stroke of God's hand, He had Nebuchadnezzar lose his senses and graze in the fields like a beast. You know why? Because God can humble the leader of the known world. I don't care whether it's the President of the United States, the President of the UN. There's nobody on the face of God's earth that is beyond God. And you know what I think? I think if God could humble Nebuchadnezzar, He could humble any one of us. And you know what God says to you today? He says, humble yourself. Instead of letting it be the stroke of God's hand upon your life, why don't you this morning make the choice to humble yourself? Because nothing meaningful is going to happen in your life spiritually until you just admit where you're at. So number one, the plea for humility. Humble yourselves. But number two, the place of humility in the sight of the Lord. That's a very interesting phrase, a very interesting statement. In the sight of the Lord. A couple of weeks ago, I was preaching to a bunch of elementary students, and whenever I preach to small kids, there's a verse that I always try to teach them to memorize, and it's Proverbs 15:3. And you know, with kids, sometimes it's good to have visual helps. And so with kids, I'll teach them this verse, Proverbs 15:3, and this is how I teach it to them. I say, Proverbs 15:3, the eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good. And I'm going to tell you something. Kids do that evil part way too well. It's human nature. Scare you to death. You know, your sight's limited, isn't it? It's limited by walls. It's limited by direction. Even though some of you think your parents have eyes in the back of their heads, it's just intuition God gave them that you're in trouble and they know that you're in bad things. That's what it is. No parent's omniscient, although they would like for you to think they are. But I'm going to tell you, there's a set of eyes. It's not limited by walls. It's not limited by direction. That's the eyes of the Lord. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord. You know what people are sometimes good at? They're good at this. They can humble themselves in the sight of men, but not in the sight of the Lord. You say, how is that possible? Let me illustrate. When I was in public high school, we had homeroom every morning. It was like a 10-minute period at the beginning of the day where we would just go in, sit down, they would take attendance, and then when the bell rang, we would all run like a herd to our first period classes. And it was often we would sit down and we would catch up a little bit with our friends that we wouldn't commonly see. And one day, one of our friends came in about 5 minutes late into homeroom and he plopped down. And he sat down there and we said, hey man, what's wrong with you? Now, this was a fellow who was like a lineman or a linebacker on our football team. He was huge. And he plops down, a little bit exasperated, and he says, boy, you'll never guess what happened to me. He said, I got a speeding ticket this morning. I got pulled over this morning by a highway patrolman. We said, really? He said, oh, yes. He said, it was horrible. He said, the guy pulled me over, and I knew that if I was going to get out of it, that I was going to have to just turn on the tears. And he said, I rolled down the window, and with my license and registration in hand, he said, I just boo-hooed like a baby. He said, just tears, just... Now, this is a guy who was on the football team, a lineman. I mean, it's like the Incredible Hulk crying is what you think about. He said, I just cried and told him that my mom and my dad, just turned it on. Just every reason why. He said, just cried. He said, the guy took my license registration. He came back and the fellow looked at us with a smile and he said, and he only gave me a warning ticket. Let me ask you a question. Did that fella humble himself in the eyes of a patrolman? Yeah, sure. But did he humble himself in the sight of the Lord? Mm-mm. I believe in our churches for a mighty work to take place, there has to be a genuineness among God's people. We've got to quit this mess of turning on a switch in front of certain people, acting a certain way, and showing a certain disposition. It's interesting. I read articles about millennials, and they talk about how millennials crave genuineness and authenticity. And you know what? I'm all for that. But I'm not just craving authenticity and genuineness. I think we ought to be godly. I think that's like a missing attribute that's in that mix. I'll tell you what, on my worst days, if I'm genuine, boy, I'm a handful. You may not be, and that's all right. I know the truth. But I just don't want to be genuine and authentic. I want to be godly, and I want to follow the Lord. And I'm telling you, if anything's going to be done, we have got to wipe off the pretenses and all of the false fronts, and we just have to humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord. That is the place of humility. In other words, we have to stop playing the game. Some of you are like, when I was a kid, I played a lot of games, but I don't play them as adults anymore. No time. No, sometimes we adults, we just play different games. Sometimes they're rehashes of the childhood game. Like the childhood game of I'm not going to talk to you because I don't like you anymore. And we just do that as adults 30 years later. But let me ask you, are you being true? Are you being genuine? Are you being authentic? Are you showing true humility? Or are you just playing a game? Teens, children do it with their parents. Church members do it with each other. And to our shame, we even do it with God when He already knows the truth. So number one, we see the plea for humility. Humble yourselves. Number two, the place of humility. That's in the sight of the Lord. Number three, I want you to see the promise of humility. And He shall lift you up. I'm going to tell you something by experience. Humbling yourself can be a painful thing. It's not why I'm here necessarily this week, but for marriage advice, I'll tell you the words I'm sorry, they not just come in handy, they can revolutionize a marriage. When somebody who's a knothead, who's always stubborn, humbles himself and looks at his wife and says, you know what, I'm sorry, and they're genuinely broken, let me tell you, there's no amount of money that can replace that. But sometimes it's a painful thing. When you have to admit you're less than perfect. People say, well, man, if I respond during an invitation or, if I acknowledge that God's working in my heart about something, people in this church are going to think that I'm not perfect. Well, I hate to tell you, but they already know you're not. And to be honest, I can't think of a better group of people in which I'd want to humble myself than with the people of God, because they know that they're flawed too, and we all desperately need God. But sometimes we think more about the pain of humility than we do the promise of humility. I was preaching at a camp years ago, and there was a teenager that came to me during the invitation. He said, I really need to talk to you. We went up into the cafeteria of the camp. We sat down, and he looked at me, and he said, now, I'm going to tell you something, but you can't tell anybody else. Now listen, I've been in that rodeo before. And I looked at him and I said, now listen, I can't make you that promise. I said, I promise you this, I'll not tell anybody. If they don't need to know, I won't tell them. He sort of looked at me like, I said, listen, I don't know if you killed a man or what. I don't know you. You just come to me and you're going to lay this bomb. I said, I promise you, I'll keep that confidence where it needs to be. And I think once he realized that I wasn't going to be a rattlemouth, he said, okay, and he opened up. And I'll never forget, the young man told me he'd had a problem with pornography. It had been a stronghold in his life. His parents had put restrictions on him, and they had their computer in the home in a certain visible spot. And he told me, he said, it's just grabbed me again. And he said, I ended up, I've been looking at it on my parents' computer. This was years ago. Now it's much more accessible than ever. And he said late at night after they'd go to bed, he said I'd stay up and get on their computer and view it. He said tonight in the service, God got a hold of my heart. And he said, I confessed it to the Lord. But he said, do you think I ought to talk to my parents about it? I said, well, whose computer did you do that on? He said, my parents. I said, whose trust did you violate after they had tried to help you? He said, my parents. But he said, I talked to the Lord about it. I said, listen, you can rationalize all you want. But I said, you've wronged them. I said, what if somebody came and got on their computer and looked at their temporary files or history? I said, they'd see your filth and they'd get pinned for it. You think that's right? And after about 5 minutes of going back and forth, I finally said, listen, if you're just going to have to make up your mind whether or not you want to get right or not. And I could appreciate the fellow, because instead of just parroting everything, okay, well, you told me to do it, I guess I will. I'm telling you, I watched the fellow wrestle with it in his eyes. And finally, he looked at me and he said, okay, I'll call him. I pulled out my cell phone. I said, all right. I said, here you go. I dialed the number, handed it to him. Now, I didn't listen to a word he said, but I watched him from a distance under the old light that was outside the gym. And I'm going to tell you something. I watched it from a distance, and I could call it play by play, even though I didn't hear a word. He started out standing erect, and the longer that conversation went, it was like this. What's happening? Well, maybe Mom answers the phone first. I want to talk to Dad. Well, honey, he's not available right now. What's wrong? Mom. And I think he just spilled his guts. And then Dad got on the phone. And by the time he had reached the lowest part of that conversation, he was almost crawling on his knees like on gravel. But a few minutes later, by the time that the end of that conversation, the young man was standing erect. And when he walked over, he handed me the phone. Now listen to this, with a smile on his face. You know how that happens? When somebody focuses not on the pain of humbling yourself, but they focus on the promise. You humble yourself, you'll be exalted. A lot of times the devil wants you to think, you know what, you humble yourself and you come clean and your life is ruined. No, you know what God says? Listen, if you'll humble yourself, then you can be helped. Amen. And what's going to make the difference of this week? I think it's whether or not we're going to focus on the pain of humility or we're going to focus on the promise of it. And I'm here to tell you, forget about this and remember this. He will lift you up. And if anybody can lift you up, it's God, isn't it? Amen. Well, if I deal with this and I get this right in my life, I'm going to be crushed forever. I'm not saying there's not going to be pain. Boy, I'd be a liar if I said, listen, you can get right with God and, there's just no pain in it and, there's no consequences. Listen, that's a man who's a liar. But the deceiver, the devil, says, oh, just worry about this, and he never points you to God's promise. When I was a kid growing up, there was a doctor I had. His name was Dr. Richards. Dr. Richards gave me all of my shots. He died when I was in elementary school. I'm not sure what happened. But I remember going to Dr. Richards' office, and there was one time in particular I remember going, and I knew I was getting a shot. And over again in my mind, I said, I will not cry, I will not cry, I will not cry, I will not cry, I will not cry. I got to Dr. Richard's office. He stuck that needle in me and I cried. But I used to love Dr. Richard's office. As a kid, I could sit there and I would see those popsicle sticks in that glass container. Those tongue depressors, I think they call them. You'd see cotton balls. But boy, there was one item I always wanted to get my hands on, and that was the stethoscope. I did one day, I don't remember when it happened, but one day when the doctor stepped out, I grabbed the stethoscope and I put that thing in my ears and I took that big old metal disc and I made a bad mistake. I went pop, 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 pop with my finger, and it's a wonder my eardrums are still intact today. I'm going to tell you, with that stethoscope, man, the sensitivity that it has. Just went to the doctor last week and they put that stethoscope on my chest. He'd listen to me breathe. He'd listen to my heartbeat. I mean, with human instrumentation, it is amazing. The sensitivity and the discernment that doctors have, all because of what looks like two rubber hoses up to the ear and a round metal disc. But you know, for God to hear our heartbeat, He doesn't need any human instrumentation. As a matter of fact, He knows what it is this morning. And I'm telling you, if God's going to do a work this week, and I believe He wants to, we just have to have a heartbeat of humility. And so I close like I started, telling you, humble yourself. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He shall lift you up.